Welcome to the debate. Usually when we look at a historical monument, we see it as something fixed, a bronze statue in a city square, right? Solid, immovable, entirely immune to the weather.
Yeah, just standing there forever.
Exactly. We look up at it, we read the little brass plaque, and the story it tells is simple, clean, and heroic. But then you start chipping away at that bronze, and you realize it's entirely hollow inside. And within that hollow space, the actual history is incredibly messy, complicated, and sometimes quite dark.
That is honestly the perfect framing for where we are right now. We all like our heroes cast in solid bronze, but the reality is always an alloy of some kind, mixing nobility with immense compromise. And honestly, we caught a major glimpse of that messy history last time.
We really did. So just a quick recap of episode 15, we tackled the character of Zeryl and the specific mechanics of his spatial manipulation.
Right, the localized vacuums.
Yeah, how he creates that localized vacuum in the void. And we debated a really fundamental question. Was that ability physically the weakest elemental art in the book just because it lacks kinetic stopping power? Or was it structurally the most consequential catalyst that shaped the entire timeline?
Right, because Zeryl's time-folding catalysts, like that simple act of creating a vacuum to fold space, is exactly what allowed a despot grandson to step out of his own era and physically meet his legendary grandfather on a historic battlefield.
Which is just wild to read.
It completely broke the timeline wide open, yeah. And it proved that sometimes the quietest elemental arts have the loudest echoes.
And it is that exact moment of time folding that forces us to reevaluate everything we thought we knew, which pivots us right into today's central question. Based on the text by Gentrics, is the original Whistling Swordsman Xeon Clerics the quintessential hero that the title promises? Or is his life ultimately a tragic cautionary tale?
The big question.
Exactly. So I am going to argue that Xeon Clerics is the quintessential hero, a man whose life-affirming elemental arts and enduring legacy drive the entire narrative forward.
And I will argue that he is a massive cautionary tale. I believe his life proves that being a legendary warrior for Pico Dash often comes at the devastating cost of being a good father, leaving behind nothing but a wake of generational trauma for his family.
Well, when I look at the text, I just cannot see the purely tragic figure you do. To me, he is the absolute heroic ideal. But, you have to start by looking at the sheer weight of what Xeon Clerics accomplished in his time.
I mean, sure, he did a lot.
He did everything. When you evaluate the geopolitical reality of Pico Dash during his era, you are looking at a continent being systematically crushed by the tyranny of Eon Pax. In that context, Xeon Clerics stood as an immovable bulwark in the Congo War.
He was definitely a major player.
Right. And we don't just have to take the myth's word for it. The text provides specific physiological evidence of his character. His mastery of the green wind isn't just a combat technique. It is literally life-affirming.
But, and this is a big but, having a gentle power doesn't make someone a flawless hero.
No, but you have to look at how that power operates. The green wind creates cellular harmony. It revitalizes the environment around him. And his heroism wasn't dependent on having a sword in his hand or being on a battlefield.
Well,
hang on, look at the chapters where he is held captive in a damp stone prison cell, right? He's surrounded by the ash and ozone of war. Even stripped of his weapons, he remained a mentor. He was a beacon of hope to the other prisoners. It is precisely that mythic, undeniable legacy of goodness that serves as the sole engine, carrying Xeon through the absolute darkness of Book 1.
I get why you say that, and the mythology is undeniably blinding. It is a great story. But I look at the systemic aftermath of his life, and I see an unacceptable cost exacted on his own bloodline.
Define unacceptable cost, though.
The reality is that because of his unresolved wars and his overarching commitment to the continent, his grandson, Xeonix, was forced to grow up in total, suffocating isolation on the outskirts of Sacar.
To keep him safe.
But was he safe? Seriously, was he? He spent his childhood worshipping a hollow myth rather than having a present, living family member to guide him. And the tragic irony here is staggering. Xeonic Clerics fought a massive war to save the world, but his own brother Ioliot spent 20 years orchestrating the psychological and physical destruction of that very grandson.
Through Malamar. Yeah.
Right, through the sleeper agent Malamar. The text ultimately proves that you cannot be a legend for Pikadesh and a safe harbor for your family simultaneously. The two roles are mutually exclusive, and his family paid the price for his legend.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective by looking at the fundamental nature of the elemental arts themselves. In Neo-Gentrics world, elemental arts are not just, random spells you memorize from a book.
No, they're tied to the person.
Exactly. They are an interface with the soul. They require a biological and spiritual alignment to manifest. Xeon Clerics' command of the green wind proves his inherent goodness because it is fundamentally an elemental art of protection.
I agree it's an art of protection, but how does that negate his actions?
Because the green wind isn't just about blowing leaves around or creating a breeze, right? It literally forces the cells of living things to regenerate and resist entropy. It requires the user to harmonize with the breath of the earth to sustain life.
Sure.
In a war where Eon Pax is actively harvesting biological material, Xeon Clerics isn't just fighting, he is actively curing the battlefield as he walks through it. You compare that directly to Iolite's corrupted, suffocating red wind, which is a physical manifestation of forced entropy and decay, and the moral contrast couldn't be clearer. Xeon Clerics wielded the power of cellular harmony to push back against an entire system of death.
You make a fair point about the nature of the green wind, but I come at it from a different way. Because possessing a, quote-unquote gentle elemental art doesn't magically erase a warrior's ruthless wartime pragmatism.
I wouldn't call it ruthless.
You are focusing entirely on the color of his wind, but you need to look at his actual administrative actions during the Congo War. Do you remember Kenshin's revelation to Xeonix midway through Book 1?
You mean about the brokering?
Exactly. Kenshin explicitly states that Xeon Clerics operated as a loan shark. Those are his exact words. He was brokering force, leveraging favors, and trading in blood debts.
Well, it was a war.
We have to remember that the Congo War wasn't just a battlefield where armies lined up and fought with honor. It was a violent, complex economy. Eon Pax's empire operated by harvesting biological capabilities from subjugated peoples, and Xeon Clerics was essentially acting as a central banker of violence within that dark economy.
A central banker?
Yes, he made deals. He traded lives for strategic positioning. Hold on, you cannot call a man who brokers blood debts a pure hero, no matter how much cellular harmony he projects when he swings his sword.
Wait, loan shark is a really harsh way to frame it, and I think that's Kenshin projecting his own cynicism onto the past. That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
How so?
You are judging a wartime commander by peacetime standards, which is a luxury none of these characters had. Let me offer an analogy to ground this. Think of Xeon Clerics not as a corrupt banker in a suit, but as a surgeon operating in a massive, chaotic triage tent.
A triage tent?
Yes. Imagine the casualties are flooding in. The medical system is collapsing under the weight of Eon Pax's armies, and people are dying in the dirt. A surgeon in that environment doesn't have the luxury of keeping their scrubs clean.
That's true.
Right? You have to operate in the mud, in the blood, making agonizingly pragmatic choices about who gets a tourniquet, who gets medicine, and who you have to leave behind. Yes, he traded in force and favors. Yes, he leveraged assets. But he did it to keep the patient, the entire continent of Pikodesh alive. The green wind is the truth of his soul. The loan sharking was simply the tragic necessity of his environment.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that his triage approach is exactly what caused the most devastating fracture in the entire narrative?
The fracture? You mean with his family?
Yes. If we are talking about agonizing choices, let's look at the turning point of his life. The betrayal in the Xaolyn Timber Forest.
Ah, the moment with his brother.
Right, the brothers Xeon Clerics and Iolite lead a research team into the sacred habitat of the Orion mystics. And under the cover of darkness, Iolite attempts to steal the Infinity Crest directly from the Orion leader.
Which was a massive violation.
Let's pause and remind ourselves what that means. He didn't just try to steal a shiny trophy. The Infinity Crest is the Earth Hearthstone. It is the literal biological anchor for that entire ecosystem. If you remove it, the forest dies.
Exactly.
The Orion Mystics die. And what does Xeon Clerics do in response? He doesn't just stop him. He fights his own brother. He physically scars him for life, and he banishes him, leaving him behind as a prisoner of the Mystics.
I mean, what was he supposed to do? Iolite was trying to rip the living heart out of a sacred ecosystem. He would have killed thousands of living creatures.
True. I am not defending Iolite's theft, but we have to look deeper into the familial rot that caused that moment to happen in the first place. Gentrics never explicitly states in Book 1 exactly why their father hated Iolite and favored Xeon Clerics from the very beginning. So I have to speculate out loud here. Let's explicitly label this as speculation, okay?
All right, let's hear the speculation.
What if Iolite simply lacked the inherent biological affinity for life-affirming elemental arts?
You mean he literally couldn't channel the green wind?
Exactly. If elemental arts are tied to biology and the soul, and he couldn't manifest the green wind of his ancestors, perhaps that made him the family outcast from day one.
Oh, wow.
Right? He grew up feeling unloved, isolated, and completely overshadowed by his golden child brother. By choosing to violently banish Iolite in the Xaolyn Forest, rather than attempting to rehabilitate him or heal that deep familial wound, Xeon Clerics effectively created his own worst enemy.
That is a very sympathetic read of Iolite.
But instead of acting like a brother, he acted like a general, and in doing so, he handed Eon Pax the perfect aggrieved weapon.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it entirely strips Xeon Clerics of the sheer moral weight of his obligations. You are asking him to put his brother above the survival of an entire civilization.
I'm asking him to be a family member.
But he had sworn a solemn, binding oath to protect the Xaolyn mystics and respect their sacred boundaries. When his brother decided to violate that trust, to steal the biological anchor of the forest, Xeon Clerics was faced with an impossible nightmare scenario.
A nightmare of his own making, partially.
No, it was Iolite's choice. Does he protect his corrupt brother out of blind tribal loyalty, letting the forest rot, or does he uphold his word and protect the living fabric of the ecosystem?
But the punishment
matched the crime. He made the agonizing, truly heroic choice to prioritize the safety of the world over his own familial bias. It wasn't a lack of love on his part. It was the ultimate demonstration of integrity. He broke his own heart to keep his promise to the Orion mystics. That is what a hero does. They bear the weight so others don't have to.
Integrity on a macro scale, perhaps. I will give you that he saved the forest. But let's look at the micro scale. Let's look at the ultimate cost of that legacy on Xeonix, his grandson.
I don't think you can blame him for things that happened decades later.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that prioritizing the world over your family equates to successful heroism, especially when you look at how it thoroughly poisoned the next generation. Let me build on your earlier points with an analogy of my own. Xeon Clerics' legend is like a massive, ancient oak tree.
Okay, I'm listening.
It is grand, it is revered, it stands taller than anything else in the forest. But if you are Xeonix, you are a sapling planted directly underneath it. And because that canopy is so dense, you get absolutely no sunlight.
Right, he was hidden away.
You get no rain. Because of the massive shadow cast by the Whistling Swordsman, Xeonix's parents felt completely terrified. They were compelled to raise him in total, suffocating ignorance on the outskirts of Sacar. It's a place deliberately removed from the elemental conflicts.
They were trying to protect him from Eon Pax.
But they kept him painfully naive to the realities of the elemental arts just to hide him from Eon Pax's forces, who were hunting the bloodline. And because he was kept in the dark, starved of the light of his own heritage, he became incredibly easy prey.
You're referring to the betrayal by Malamar.
Exactly. Malamar spent 20 years masquerading as the mentor figure, Kenshin. 20 years.
It is a staggering amount of time.
Think about the scale of that. That is 2 decades orchestrating a meticulous psychological operation against the child.
He deliberately fed Xeonic half-truths about the elemental arts. He taught him incorrect stances to fundamentally cripple his natural fighting instincts.
Yeah, it was brutal to read.
He set him up to fail at every turn, all because Iolite wanted long-simmering vengeance against his brother. The legacy of Xeon Clerics didn't protect Xeonic. It painted a neon target on his back and left him completely without the tools to defend himself. The myth was, in execution, a curse.
It is very easy to look at the fallout decades later with perfect hindsight and declare the man a failure. But you are completely ignoring the most profoundly human moment in the entire text.
Oh, here we go.
Not really. To understand Xeon Clerics, we have to look at the climax, and we have to remember the strict canonical rules of Gentrics' universe here.
The time travel rules.
Yes, only Xeonix travels through time, nobody else, ever. Xeon Clerics never leaves his own fixed point in the Congo War timeline.
Right. It's a one-way bridge for the grandson.
Exactly. He does not have the luxury of reading book 1. He doesn't know about Sacar or Malamar or the 20-year psychological operation. Yet, when Zeryl folds space, creating that vacuum we talked about, and the universe literally bleeds together across eras, Xeonix lands squarely in the mud, blood, and ash of that historic battlefield.
Right in the middle of the most violent clash between the red and green winds. It is absolute chaos.
Total chaos. And amidst that absolute carnage, surrounded by the horrors of the Congo War, Xeon Clerics looks across the battlefield. He sees a young man he doesn't know, but who is fighting with a deeply familiar style.
He recognizes the forms.
Yeah, and when he realizes, when it clicks for him, that this terrified young man is the grandson he will never get to see grow up, what does he do?
He stops fighting.
He doesn't ask for help winning the war, even though he desperately needs it. He doesn't conscript the boy into his army like a pragmatic loan shark banker would, right? He smiles amidst the fire and the blood, and he begs Xeonix to flee.
Yeah.
He orders him to get to safety and live his life. That single fleeting moment dismantles the idea that he was just a cold, pragmatic legend who only cared about his duty. It proves that beneath the myth, beneath the massive obligations to Pikodesh and the Xaolyn mystics, he was a deeply loving patriarch who wanted absolutely nothing more than the survival and happiness of his family.
It is a powerful moment in the text. I will readily grant you that. It is the one time we really get to see the human being behind the bronze statue, so to speak. Stripped of the title, just a grandfather looking at his legacy.
Exactly. It completely recontextualizes everything he did. It brings us back to how we evaluate these figures and why this book is so deeply resonant.
It really is.
And today, we've unpacked two vastly different perspectives on Gentrics' defining character. I have argued throughout that Xeon Clerics is the ultimate hero, a man who utilized the life-affirming cellular harmony of the green wind to stand as a shield for a broken continent, even when it cost him his relationship with his own brother.
And I have maintained that he operates as a profound cautionary tale, a man whose overarching, pragmatic commitment to the world created a massive, suffocating shadow that starved his descendants. It left his grandson isolated in Sacar, naive to the world and actively hunted by a deeply traumatized family member.
But in the spirit of this discourse, in looking objectively at the text, I have to acknowledge the absolute truth in your analysis of the fallout.
Oh?
Yeah, I concede that the title of the Whistling Swordsman placed an inherently unfair, lethal target on the backs of the entire Novus family. Xeon Clerics' outsized reputation, that massive oak tree canopy, directly caused the suffocating environment in Sacar.
Right. They had nowhere else to go.
His inability to heal his brother is the direct catalyst for Xeonix's suffering at the hands of Malamar. The legacy was, in many tangible ways, a profound danger to the people he loved most. You cannot separate the trauma from the triumph.
I appreciate that. And looking at the broader context of the lore, I must concede your point regarding the sheer horrific realities of his environment. In a world as fundamentally brutal as Pikodesh during that era, where Eon Pax was actively harvesting the biological capabilities of innocent people and subjugating entire populations, Someone had to stand up.
Somebody had to be the shield.
Wielding the green wind to stand against that industrial-scale tyranny was an undeniable act of heroism. Facing down the corrupted, entropic red wind of Iolite to save the Earth Hearthstone, even when it broke his own heart to banish his brother, undoubtedly saved countless lives. He made the impossible triage choices that a surgeon in the mud simply had to make.
Understanding both the myth and the man deepens our appreciation of the source material immensely. Gentrics didn't write a simple fairy tale with clear-cut good guys and bad guys. He wrote a complex ecosystem of cause and effect.
It's all about consequences.
Exactly. When you look at the monument of Xeon Clerics, you have to decide for yourself how to weigh the solid bronze of his deeds against the hollow, tragic spaces inside his family life. The listener must ultimately weigh the cost of that heroism for themselves.
Because there are no clean answers in the Congo War. There are only enduring echoes.
Which means there is always more to explore in the material, especially when it comes to the mechanics of this universe. So join us next time for episode 17, where we ask, is the Whistling Wind elemental system actually fair as written? We will dive deep into the biological toll of the kinetic arts, and whether the physical costs outweigh the benefits.
Should be a fun one.
Until then, remember that beneath every fixed statue in the square, there is a very messy, very human foundation.